In the sterile silence of the war room, the only sound was the low hum of classified servers. I stood at attention, my gaze fixed on a tactical map that felt a universe away. Around the polished table sat men who moved armies with a single word. Generals, attaches, and the highest echelons of Allied intelligence. My father, Colonel John Miller, a man who believed legacy was his birthright to bestow, was seated among them as a guest. I could see his face, etched with a familiar, condescending smirk. He was waiting for me to fail. To prove him right. My commanding officer, General Hale, a leader whose quiet respect I valued more than any medal, turned to me. He asked a long, complex question in fluent Dari, his words weaving a strategic problem that had no easy answer. The smirk on my father's face widened. This was the moment of my humiliation. I took a breath, met the general's gaze, and delivered my analysis. The words flowed, not as a translation but as an extension of my own thoughts, clear, authoritative, and absolute. The Allied officers, men who knew the language of their homeland, nodded slowly, their expressions filled with a dawning respect. Then, General Hale turned his gaze from me and settled it directly on my father. His voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. She is... Aegis. My father's face. It just crumbled. The arrogance evaporated, the pride shattered, and all that was left was the hollowed-out shock of a man confronting a truth so far beyond his comprehension that it broke him right there in his seat. It was the end of a war he never even knew we were fighting. That shattering moment, however, was born from a much quieter, more casual act of cruelty 2 months prior. I had invited my father to a family day at the facility, a foolish, hopeful attempt to bridge the gap between his world and mine. In a sterile corridor, we ran into General Hale. My father immediately puffed out his chest, his voice booming with false camaraderie. "General," he laughed, clapping my shoulder. "Good of you to give these kids something to do. My girl here loves her little translator tricks. Back in my day, we just called it eavesdropping." The comment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just the insult, it was the public performance of it. The way he dismissed a decade of my life's work in front of the one man who actually understood it. It was every birthday he'd ever belittled, every achievement he'd ever ignored, all distilled into one dismissive phrase. A familiar coldness settled deep in my bones, but this time it wasn't sadness. It was fury, sharp and clear and absolute. He laughed, thinking it was just another joke at my expense. He had no idea he'd just belittled me in front of the one man who reviewed my threat assessments every morning. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. To my family, my life was a footnote in the grand story of my brother. I remember one Thanksgiving vividly, the air thick with the smell of turkey, and the sound of a football game my father was losing his mind over. My brother Mark, the family's golden boy, was holding court at the dinner table. He had just been promoted to captain, a real soldier in a family that worshipped the uniform, and he wore his charisma like a shield. He was everything my father had ever wanted in a child, and the pride radiating from my father was so bright it was almost blinding. He stood, raised a glass, and his voice boomed across the table. To a real soldier, he declared, his eyes locked on Mark. To carrying on the Miller legacy in the field, where it matters. Everyone cheered. I felt a familiar, dull ache settle in my chest. Later, when there was a lull in the conversation, I tried to gently enter their world. I mentioned a professional commendation I had just received, a formal acknowledgement for my analytical work. My father, who was mid-laugh at one of Mark's stories, glanced at me with a polite, vacant smile. "That's nice, honey. Very smart," he said, before immediately turning back to my brother. "Hey, Mark, did you hear your unit is finally getting the new M4A1S?" And just like that, I was gone again, erased. It wasn't just that moment. It was every moment. My commendation was a piece of paper. Mark's new rifle was a tangible piece of the legacy. This was the internal ledger I kept. The tally of every time my academic achievements were called cute while Mark's physical fitness scores were framed like battlefield victories. They called me the smart one, our little bookworm, but they weren't compliments. They were labels designed to put me in a safe, harmless box, a hobbyist in a family of warriors. But that house was just a place I visited. My real life happened in the dark, 300 feet underground in a place where my name didn't matter. My reality was a sensitive compartmented information facility, a SCIF, It was a cold, silent world, lit only by the blue glow of a dozen monitors, each one a fire hose of raw data pouring in from the other side of the planet. At 3 a.m, while my family slept, I was hunting for ghosts in the static. I was conducting what we called a nightingale analysis, sifting through terabytes of low-frequency chatter from a high-threat province. The work was grueling, a search for a single needle in a continent-sized haystack of noise. But then, I heard it. A whisper. An almost inaudible phrase in a rare Pashto dialect. A keyword we knew was linked to IED initiation protocols. My heart hammered against my ribs. My training took over. I isolated the audio, cross-referencing the signal's metadata with real-time drone surveillance logs from the area. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up satellite imagery, heat signatures, and movement patterns. It all connected, a ghost of a signal pointing to a very real, very deadly threat. I drafted a critic message, the highest priority intelligence communication that exists. It meant a life-or-death situation was in progress, and my analysis was the only thing standing in the way. There was no time for doubt. I hit send, my entire being focused on the single critical fact that dozens of soldiers just like my brother, were sleeping just yards from where that device was planted. Hours later, I received the after-action report. The EOD team had found the device exactly where my analysis indicated. Dozens of lives saved. My only validation was a single handwritten note from General Hale on my report. It just said, "Exceptional." That one word, written in quiet respect, meant more to me than 1,000 of my father's hollow toasts. That was the disconnect I lived with every single day. At home, I was a disappointment. At work, I was a shield. The person who enabled this duality, the one who enforced the fragile peace, was my mother. I can still hear her voice, a tired, pleading whisper, after I'd tried to explain my frustration. "Don't rock the boat, Elena," she would say. "You know how your father is. He just understands boots on the ground, not all this." Her words were meant to soothe, but they were poison. They taught me that my desire for respect was a disruption, an inconvenience to the family's carefully constructed narrative. Her silence, her constant prioritizing of my father's ego over my own worth, it was its own kind of betrayal. She wasn't keeping the peace, she was simply choosing whose feelings mattered more. And it was never, ever mine. For years, I had tried to translate my world into their language of football games and infantry tactics. I finally realized my mistake. They didn't need a translator, they needed a demonstration. So I decided to speak to my father in the only language he truly respected, protocol. After my father's parlor tricks comment, something inside me went quiet. The drive home was silent, but my mind was a whirlwind. For years I had fought for his approval on his terms, emotional, messy, and ultimately impossible. I saw a lifetime of trying to be heard, of hoping for a crumb of recognition, and I realized it was a battle I could never win. Not in his arena. That night, I made a decision. There would be no more arguments, no more pleading, no more tears. I was done with that. Instead, I would orchestrate a correction. This wasn't about revenge, which felt hot and chaotic. This was about clarification. Cold, precise, and irrefutable, delivered. Within the very system of rank and protocol that he worshipped. A few days later, an email announced an upcoming Joint Task Force interoperability briefing. It was a high-level meeting with key Afghan military liaisons, a room full of people who understood the stakes of my work. It was the perfect venue. My position as a subject matter expert gave me input on the guest list, a small procedural privilege I had never used before. I logged into the secure portal, my fingers moving with a deliberate calm I hadn't felt in years. I typed in his name, Colonel Rhett John Miller. For the invitation category, I selected Legacy Distinguished Visitor. It was the perfect bait, a title that appealed directly to his vanity, a formal acknowledgement of a past he could not let go of. He would see it as an honor, an invitation to a world he thought he still commanded. He would be unable to resist. The final piece of the strategy required a delicate touch. I scheduled a brief call with General Hale's aide, a sharp, no-nonsense captain who lived by the book. I didn't mention my father, or the disrespect, or anything personal. I simply framed my request in the language of the mission. I suggested that a live language validation exercise during the briefing would be a powerful way to demonstrate our unit's unique capabilities to our allied guests. The aide agreed instantly. "That's a great idea, Miller. The general will love it. I'll put it on the agenda. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. With that, the trap was baited and set. Every component was in place, operating under the official sanction of the system itself. I felt a quiet, cold satisfaction, the clean feeling of a complex problem solved. The embossed invitation was sent via official courier. My father's please reply was immediate. He had no idea he wasn't being invited to observe my world. He was being summoned to a formal review of his own ignorance. When I walked into the Strategic Operations Center at Fort Meade, the air itself felt heavy with authority. The room was a theater of power, dominated by a massive U-shaped table polished to a mirror shine. At its head sat General Hale, flanked by American generals and stern-faced Afghan military dignitaries. My station was a small, functional analyst's console set against the wall, physically and metaphorically removed from the circle of command. It was where I belonged, in the background. Then my father arrived, resplendent in his dress uniform, wearing an air of borrowed importance like a second skin. He moved through the room with a confident swagger, shaking hands with officers who only knew him by his past rank, a relic telling war stories in a room where the future of warfare was being decided. As he passed my console, he caught my eye and gave me a slow, patronizing wink, the kind of gesture you give a child before a piano recital. I felt a surge of ice in my veins. This is it, I thought. No turning back. General Hale began the briefing, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. He outlined the immense complexities of signals intelligence in the Hindu Kush, a region of shifting allegiances and ancient dialects. Traditional methods are failing, he stated, his eyes sweeping the room. The enemy communicates in layers of dialect and code that are nearly impenetrable. He paused for a beat, letting the weight of the problem settle. He then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling directly on my father. "Colonel," he said, his tone dangerously neutral, "you mentioned your daughter's tricks. Let's see one." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. Every eye turned first to my father, then to me. His trap, the one he had laid for me my entire life, had just been sprung. Only he was the one caught in it. The general turned fully in his chair to face me. Then, in flawless, formal Dari, he asked a complex, multi-part operational question. He wasn't just asking for a translation, he was asking for a detailed threat assessment based on conflicting intercepts from the coast, sanctuary, a projection of an enemy network's most likely infiltration route, and a specific confidence level in my own analysis. It was a question designed to test the absolute limit of an analyst's ability. Across the room, I saw my father's smirk widen. This was it. The moment of my public unmasking. The proof that I was nothing more than a hobbyist playing dress-up in a world of real soldiers. He was radiating pure, triumphant certainty. I stood up. A strange, perfect calm settled over me. I met the general's eyes and delivered my answer. The Dari flowed from me not as a memorized script, but as a living language, crisp and commanding. I referenced specific intercept call signs, outlined the 3 most probable routes of infiltration, and concluded with a confidence level of 95%. As I spoke, I watched the Afghan officers at the table. They leaned forward, their eyes wide with a stunned admiration that was utterly foreign to me. One of them, a grizzled old general with a chest full of medals, murmured just loud enough for the table to hear, "Incredible." The first crack in my father's reality appeared. General Hale let my answer hang in the deafening silence of the room. He let the validation from our allies sink in. Then, he turned his gaze, now hard as forged steel, back to my father. For 3 years, the general's voice rang with an authority that seemed to shake. The very walls, every major terror plot north of Kabul has been dismantled, based on the intelligence of one analyst, a ghost operator whose name is spoken with reverence by every SEAL and Green Beret who has ever worked in that AO. The general paused, letting the final devastating blow gather its full force. "You know her as your daughter. We know her as Aegis." The name landed in the room like a physical weight, crushing the air, crushing the silence, crushing my father. I watched his face. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The smugness was the first to go, then the pride, then the condescending certainty, all of it vanishing in an instant. It was replaced by a wave of pale, slack-jawed shock, the look of a man forced to gaze upon a universe he never knew existed. And then the most amazing thing happened. He instinctively, subconsciously began to rise from his chair. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was the ingrained, conditioned response of a career soldier, a colonel, in the sudden, unexpected presence of a being of impossibly higher strategic importance. His worldview had shattered, and protocol was all he had left. My father had spent my entire life teaching me the importance of rank. In the end, it only took 6 words for him to finally learn who outranked who. As the formal briefing concluded, the room exhaled. The stiff silence was replaced by the scrape of chairs and a low murmur of conversation, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. It had reoriented itself entirely around me. The Afghan general who had called my analysis incredible was the first to approach me, speaking to me not in English, but in his native Dari, asking a follow-up question with the deep respect one professional shows another. Other high-ranking officers followed, forming a small circle around my humble analyst's console. They weren't making small talk, they were engaging me in a serious technical discussion, treating me as the ultimate authority in the room. Across that room, my father remained seated. He was no longer the proud colonel, the distinguished guest. He was just a man in an old uniform, rendered small and silent by a truth he couldn't comprehend. People walked past him, their focus entirely on the conversation happening around me. He had become invisible. I watched as he finally stood, his movements stiff and uncertain. He didn't look at anyone, and no one looked at him. He slipped out of a side door, a ghost leaving a world that no longer recognized him. I watched him go, and the feeling inside me wasn't triumph. There was no surge of victory, no satisfying sting of revenge. There was just a quiet, profound sense of closure. It was the feeling of a heavy, 100-pound door that I had been holding, shut my entire life, finally locking itself, leaving me free to walk away. That feeling of quiet closure became the foundation for everything that followed. A year later, my world looked completely different. I no longer worked at a small console against the wall. Now, my name was on a heavy office door with a polished brass nameplate. Dr. Elena Miller, Section Chief, CENTCOM Advanced Threat Analysis. I was leading my own division, guiding a team of the brightest analysts I had ever met, standing at the head of our briefing table, guiding them through a complex problem. I felt a sense of belonging that I had never known. The dynamic was one of deep, mutual respect, a fast-paced exchange of ideas where competence was the only currency that mattered. This was my real family, one forged in the fires of shared purpose, not dysfunctional obligation. On my desk, next to a photo of my team laughing during a late-night session, sits a single, heavy challenge coin. It's the personal coin of General Hale, given to me the day he retired. In military culture, a coin like that is more than a gift. It's a symbol of shared hardship, a token of the deepest professional respect a commander can show. It sits in a small, clear stand, and beneath it is a tiny engraved plaque. It doesn't say my name. It says, "To Aegis, the shield of the brave." I would look at that coin and understand. The validation I had spent decades begging my father for. I had already earned it from people who truly understood what my work meant. It wasn't given to me because of my last name. It was given to me because of the lives I had saved. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in months. It was my father. My hand hesitated for a moment before I opened it. The message was short. "I saw your name in a declassified commendation list," it read. I didn't understand. "I'm sorry." I read the words, and I waited for a feeling to surface. Anger, satisfaction, maybe even a flicker of the old sadness. But nothing came. It was just information on a screen. His apology, the words I once would have given anything to hear, was no longer relevant to my life. His validation was never his to give. I had already earned it. I placed the phone face down on my desk and turned my attention back to the massive intelligence map on the wall, back to my work, back to my life. My father believed a legacy was something you inherit. I learned a true legacy is built in silence and acknowledged in public. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story in the comments. In this community, your expertise is always recognized,